She scanned human DNA for weakness and found weapons. Zora adjusted the focus on the holographic emitter and watched the golden strands of the human's genome spin in the air. The man sitting on the observation plinth remained disturbingly still. Cyrus had been stripped to a simple pair of tactile shorts, his bronze skin a stark contrast to the sterile, silver surfaces of the Xandari examination room. Zora moved her scanner over his chest and noted the way his pectoral muscles twitched under the invisible light. He was far more solid than the reports on terrestrial mammals suggested. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers against his shoulder to stabilize her sensor. His skin felt like a furnace. "You are radiating an unusual amount of thermal energy," she said. The heat from his body seeped into her pale blue fingertips and sent a strange jolt of electricity up her arm. "It is a side effect of being kept in a cold room while some alien tells me I am a lesser being," replied Cyrus. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. Zora looked up and met his dark eyes. They were not filled with the fear she expected from a Tier 3 species representative. Instead, they burned with a focused, predatory intensity. She felt her own pulse quicken as she realized he was watching her with the same analytical hunger she was supposed to be directing at him. She stepped back and adjusted her posture to reclaim her status. She was the lead geneticist of the hegemony, and he was a specimen. Yet, as she looked at the breadth of his shoulders and the thick lines of his thighs, the clinical distance felt like it was melting away. Zora moved to the primary console and initiated the deep tissue probe. The light turned a deep violet and washed over Cyrus. He took a sharp breath, and his hands gripped the edge of the plinth. The metal groaned under his strength. Zora watched the readouts with growing confusion. His heart rate was climbing, but his oxygen saturation remained perfect. It was as if his body was preparing for a massive physical exertion without even trying. She walked around the table and her hip brushed against his knee. The contact was brief, but it felt like a brand. She stopped and looked at him, her violet eyes searching his face for signs of distress. "Does the probe cause you pain?" she asked. She noticed the way his nostrils flared as he took in her scent. "No, it just makes me want to move," said Cyrus. He leaned forward, and his face was inches from hers. Zora could see the fine stubble on his jaw and the slight scar across his bottom lip. He looked like something carved from earth and fire, a creature of density and raw power. The air between them grew thick with a tension that had nothing to do with science. She should have pushed him back, but her hand stayed on the console. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she watched the way his throat moved when he swallowed. He was a biological enigma, a creature that seemed to generate gravity. The scan results began to flicker on the wall, showing the complex architecture of his double helix, but Zora found herself focused on the way the light played over the ridges of his abdomen. The data stream suddenly turned from gold to a warning shade of crimson. Zora blinked and turned her attention back to the holographic display. She had been taught that 98% of human DNA was non-coding, junk, a relic of a failed evolutionary path. The hegemony dismissed it as biological clutter. But as the deep probe bypassed the surface layers, those dormant segments began to glow with a terrifying brilliance. She saw sequences that didn't match any known terrestrial animal. They were encrypted, hidden behind layers of epigenetic locks. Her breath caught in her throat as the computer began to translate the functions of those hidden genes. It wasn't junk. It was a secondary operating system. "What are you seeing?" asked Cyrus. He stood up and the movement was so fluid it startled her. He was taller than she had realized, a tower of muscle and intent. "I am seeing things that should not exist in a natural environment," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. She pointed at a specific sequence that was pulsing like a heartbeat. The translation read, "Adaptive bone density reinforcement." Another sequence labeled adrenal overdrive suppression was flickering. These were not traits for a social species. These were the blueprints for an apex predator designed to kill things 10 times its size. She realized that humans had spent thousands of years suppressing these traits to live in a civilization, but the potential was still there, coiled like a serpent in every cell. He wasn't a Tier 3 specimen. He was a walking weapons system that had been deactivated by its own will. She felt a wave of terror, followed immediately by a surge of overwhelming attraction. The realization that Cyrus was a latent titan made her knees feel weak. She looked at the scan of his neural pathways. His brain was wired for a level of spatial awareness and combat reflex that exceeded Xandari elite guards. When he looked at her, he wasn't just seeing a scientist. He was calculating every exit, every movement, and perhaps the exact curve of her waist. Zora felt her skin flush a deeper shade of blue. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer the observer. She was in a room with a creature that could tear the station apart if he chose to. She reached out and touched the center of his chest, feeling the heavy, steady thud of his heart. "You have been hiding this," she said. She looked up at him and saw a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We didn't hide it, Zora. We just haven't had a reason to use it in a long time," said Cyrus. He placed his hand over hers, trapping it against his skin. His palm was rough and warm. The sensation sent a thrill through her that she couldn't suppress. He leaned in and his breath teased her ear. The scent of him was musk and sun-warmed skin, something ancient and grounding. She felt her resolve crumbling. The scientific ethics she lived by meant nothing compared to the physical magnetism he exerted. He was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, and all she wanted was to see what happened when those dormant sequences finally fully ignited. She let her hand slide down to his waist, feeling the corded muscle of his obliques. A sudden, violent explosion rocked the observation deck. The lights flickered and turned to a harsh emergency red. Zora was thrown forward, but Cyrus caught her with one arm, his grip like iron. The station's internal comms screeched with the voice of Zev, the High Chancellor's rival. He announced a coup, stating that the station was now under his control and all inferior assets were to be purged. Valen and her squad of armored guards appeared at the glass doors of the lab, their plasma rifles leveled at the room. They weren't there to rescue them. They were there to eliminate the evidence of the human's genetic potential. "Stay behind me," said Cyrus. His voice had changed. It was no longer a rumble, it was a growl. Zora watched in awe as his body began to transform. It wasn't a change in shape, but a change in presence. His veins stood out against his skin, and his eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. The junk DNA was no longer dormant. The stress of the attack had acted as a chemical key. He looked at the reinforced glass door and didn't reach for a tool. He reached for the frame. With a grunt of effort, he ripped the heavy sliding mechanism off its track. The metal shrieked as it was torn from the wall. Valen fired, but Cyrus was already moving. He moved with a speed that the Xandari sensors couldn't track. He wasn't running. He was a blur of kinetic energy. He closed the distance to the guards before they could fire a second volley. Zora watched as he disarmed the first guard with a strike so fast she only saw the afterimage. He used the guard's own rifle as a club, shattering the Xandari's helmet with a single blow. Valen tried to retreat, but Cyrus grabbed the barrel of her weapon and bent it like it was made of soft plastic. He didn't use any sophisticated martial arts. He used raw, overwhelming force. In less than 30 seconds, the hallway was cleared. He stood over the fallen guards, his chest heaving, his skin slick with sweat. "We need to go," said Cyrus. He turned back to Zora, and she saw the wildness in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had finally found a reason to be what he was meant to be. "The secondary docks are this way," she said. She grabbed his hand and led him through the smoke-filled corridors. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. The danger was everywhere, but she felt a strange sense of safety next to him. Every time a blast shook the floor, he pulled her closer to his side. They ducked into a maintenance tunnel that led toward the bioluminescent gardens. The air was thick with the scent of exotic flora, providing a temporary shield from the chaos of the main decks. Zora pushed open a heavy door, and they tumbled into a secluded alcove, hidden behind a wall of glowing blue vines. The silence of the gardens was a sharp contrast to the screams and gunfire echoing through the station. Cyrus leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, his breathing heavy. The adrenaline was clearly taking its toll on his system. Zora moved toward him, her hands trembling. She reached out to check the wounds on his shoulder where a stray plasma bolt had grazed him. The skin was already beginning to knit together at an accelerated rate. She had never seen a biological recovery this fast. She touched the wound and he hissed, his eyes snapping open. He grabbed her wrists and pinned them against the wall above her head. "You shouldn't touch me right now, Zora," he said. His voice was thick with a mixture of pain and something far more carnal. "Why not?" she asked. She didn't try to pull away. She looked at the way his chest moved, the muscles still tight and ready. "Because the same system that lets me fight like a demon is the one that controls everything else," said Cyrus. He pressed his body against hers, and she could feel the heat radiating from him in waves. The pheromones he was emitting were overwhelming, a chemical cocktail designed to attract and dominate. Zora felt a pulse of desire so strong it made her head swim. She leaned her head back and exposed her throat to him. She wanted him to stop being a specimen. She wanted him to be a man. He let out a low groan and buried his face in the crook of her neck. His teeth grazed her skin, not enough to break it, but enough to make her gasp. His hands released her wrists and slid down to her waist, pulling her flush against him. Zora wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of desperate need and newfound power. He tasted of copper and salt, a primitive flavor that woke something dormant in her own Xandari blood. He lifted her easily, her legs wrapping around his hips as he backed her further into the shadows of the glowing vines. The bioluminescent light cast long, shifting shadows across his back as he moved with a rhythmic, driving intensity. She felt every inch of his strength, the way his body seemed to hum with the energy of 1,000 suns. The intimacy was more than physical. Zora felt as if she were being swept away by a tidal wave of human emotion. His passion was a weapon in its own right, a force that could level cities or build empires. She had spent her life studying the cold, calculated genetics of the hegemony, but this was something different. This was life in its most concentrated form. She clung to him as the world outside continued to burn. In this moment, the coup didn't matter. The galaxy didn't matter. There was only the heat of his skin, the strength of his hands, and the way he looked at her as if she were the only thing in the universe that could ground him. Afterward, they lay together on the soft, mossy floor of the alcove. The emergency lights from the station reflected off the glass dome above, showing the stars beyond. Cyrus held her against his side, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The wildness had receded, replaced by a quiet, watchful calm. Zora rested her head on his chest and listened to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. She knew that everything had changed. She could never go back to being a scientist for the hegemony. She had seen the truth. They weren't evaluating humans for weakness. They were poking a sleeping giant. "What happens when the rest of your people arrive?" she asked. She looked up at him, her eyes soft in the dim light. "They won't come for war, Zora, they'll come for me," said Cyrus. He looked at the sky and she saw a fleet of small, fast ships dropping out of warp. They didn't look like Xandari vessels. They were jagged, functional, and built for speed. "My brother Jude is leading the retrieval team," he said. He sat up and helped her to her feet. He looked at her with an expression that was surprisingly tender. "I can't stay here, and neither can you," he said. He took her hand and led her back toward the maintenance door. "They'll hunt you for what you know," he said. Zora nodded. She knew he was right. She had seen the blueprints of the human weapon, and she had experienced its power firsthand. She wasn't just a scientist anymore. She was an accomplice to the awakening of a species. They emerged from the gardens and found the station in a state of total collapse. Zev's forces were retreating as the human ships began to dock. The human soldiers moved with a coordinated efficiency that made the Xandari guards look like amateurs. They didn't use heavy armor. They used shadows and speed. Zora watched as Jude and his team secured the main hangar. They were all like Cyrus, lean, muscular, and carrying an aura of contained violence. Valen tried to make a final stand near the escape pods, but a single flashbang from the human team neutralized her squad instantly. "Cyrus, report," called out Jude. He approached them with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked at Zora and his eyes narrowed, but he didn't raise his weapon. "The data is secured, and the scientist comes with us," said Cyrus. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Jude looked at the way Cyrus was holding Zora's hand, and he gave a short, knowing nod. "Get to the shuttle. The hegemony fleet is 3 minutes out," said Jude. He turned back to his team and began barking orders. Cyrus led Zora onto the sleek, dark vessel. The interior was cramped and smelled of oil and recycled air, but it felt more alive than any Xandari ship she had ever been on. As the shuttle cleared the station, Zora looked through the viewport. The massive Xandari dreadnoughts were arriving, but they weren't firing. They were hovering, hesitant. They had seen the footage from the lab. They had seen what one human could do when the locks were taken off his DNA. The hegemony was built on the fear of others, but for the first time in their history, they were the ones who were afraid. They realized that humanity wasn't a resource to be harvested. It was a fire that, if fanned, would consume the galaxy. "Where are we going?" asked Zora. She sat down on the bench next to Cyrus. He reached out and pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her with a possessive strength. "To a place where you don't have to look at DNA to see who someone is," said Cyrus. He kissed her forehead, and she felt the tension finally leave her body. The shuttle jumped into warp, leaving the dying station and the terrified hegemony behind. Zora knew the road ahead would be dangerous, and that the war was likely just beginning. But as she looked at the man who had redefined her understanding of life, she wasn't afraid. She had found something more powerful than any genetic sequence. She had found the human heart, and it was the greatest weapon of all. The journey to the human territories was short but transformative. Zora spent the time studying the records Cyrus provided. She learned that humanity had almost destroyed itself many times, and each time they had evolved. Their history was a cycle of chaos and rebirth. She realized that the weapons she had found in their DNA were just tools for survival. The real strength of humanity was their ability to love and protect with the same intensity they used to fight. She looked at Cyrus, who was sleeping in the bunk across from her, his face finally at peace. "We are here," said Jude over the comms. The shuttle began to descend toward a planet that glowed with a vibrant, healthy green. It wasn't a perfect, engineered world like the Xandari homeworld. It was wild, messy, and beautiful. "Welcome to Earth," said Cyrus. He woke up and reached for her hand. As they stepped out onto the landing pad, the air was filled with the sounds of a bustling city and the smell of rain on hot pavement. Zora took a deep breath and smiled. She had scanned human DNA for weakness and found a weapon, but she had also found a home. She leaned against Cyrus and watched the sun set over the horizon, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be.